Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I am your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series along with related movies and books, and examine them in the context of 1980s America. This time around, it's just me here in the studio, all on my own, here to talk about MK Ultra and Stephen King's novel, Firestarter. So MK Ultra, we're cheating a little bit with this particular topic because it's not something that pertains to the 1980s directly. It didn't happen in the 1980s as far as anyone knows, although that is a little bit unclear. The project began in 1953 and was officially shut down in 1973, although it's not clear if it's continued after that. As I said, it was officially shut down in 1973, but under the orders of the head of the CIA, Richard Helms, many of the documents associated with it were destroyed. There is speculation and conspiracy theories that it continued after 1973 unofficially, and after it was revealed to the public in 1975. MK Ultra did capture the public's imagination and permeate or pervade much of the pop culture entertainment of the 1980s, including, obviously, Firestarter. But I am getting ahead of myself. What was MK Ultra? MK Ultra was a program that was established by the CIA in 1953. It was begun by Allen Dulles, who was concerned about reports of U.S. service members being brainwashed by communist nations, specifically the Soviet Union and China. He called it brain warfare. And so he wanted to start a U.S. program to be able to combat that brain warfare that was being waged on innocent Americans by these evil communists. And so it began in 1953 under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist and expert in poison. After Gottlieb left the MK Ultra program, he turned his attention to developing poisons and poison gadgets to assassinate world leaders. According to the book Wolves, Jackals, and Foxes, The Assassins Who Changed History, he came up with ideas to try to assassinate Fidel Castro by using such things as a poisonous fountain pen, a poisoned cigar, a poisoned wetsuit, an exploding conch shell, and at one point came up with the idea of trying to saturate Castro's shoes with thallium so that Castro's beard would fall out. It's some wacky stuff, man. MK Ultra had three main prongs, or three main goals, which were mind control, spying, and torture or interrogation, let's say enhanced interrogation techniques. So the idea was to use hallucinogenic drugs such as LSD, mescaline, and so forth in order to break down people's mental barriers, in order to create soldiers or spies that could be controlled by the United States government. So that was one prong, was the whole mind control aspect. In order to gain information and participate in espionage against other countries. So part of the idea was to create sleeper agents in communist nations that could be activated and do the bidding of the US government against those other countries. It was also a means of interrogating captured spies and enemy soldiers. And as I said, it was a form of psychological torture. So MK Ultra focused on establishing psychic spies, psychic in the sense of being mind controlled or coerced psychologically and tortured psychologically in order to promote US interests. Part of the problem with MK Ultra is that this was conducted against many people, primarily US citizens, but also citizens of Canada and also Denmark, often against people's will or against their knowledge without their consent. It was carried out primarily in three places: university campuses, hospitals, and in prisons. One of the interesting operations conducted as part of MK Ultra was an operation called Midnight Climax. And when you look at the history of MK Ultra, it is by turns horrifying in what was done to people without their consent, but also really comical. The government employed prostitutes who lured clients to CIA safe houses for experimentation. So the prostitutes would take them to the safe houses and then dose them with drugs while CIA agents watched through two-way mirrors and engaged in voyeurism and decadent behavior. And in fact, the head of that particular operation, George White, said, "Of course, I was a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill and cheat, steal, deceive, rape and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" As I said, this program, MK Ultra, was officially ended in 1973, and it became publicly known in 1975. It was ended by President Gerald Ford because of public pressure after the Watergate scandal and the resignation of President Nixon. And there was increased scrutiny on US government misdoings or malfeasance, and a really growing distrust of the American government and its abuse of American citizens. Documents pertaining to the program were ordered destroyed by the head of the CIA, a man named Richard Helms, which has led to those conspiracy theories and to the speculation that it didn't actually end, and that much of the goals of the program weren't officially known, and that it was more nefarious than people actually realized or understood. And that leads us into Firestarter. Now, I have a first edition copy of Firestarter that was published in 1980. It's in really rough shape. I'm pretty sure I picked it up at a yard sale somewhere for like 25 cents. It's, has water damage. The dust jacket is missing now because it was all torn up and eventually I had to throw it away. I also have a paperback edition that was published just a few years ago, and it is that paperback version that I used in the class on which this podcast was based. And the reason why I mention this is the first edition did not contain an afterword that later editions did. And which was included in that paperback edition that I used in my class. And I just want to read part of that. Well, Firestarter is just a novel, a made-up tale with which I hope you, reader, have passed a pleasant evening or two. Most of the novel's components are based on actual happenings, either unpleasant or inexplicable or simply fascinating. Among the unpleasant ones is the undeniable fact that the U.S. government, or agencies thereof, has indeed administered potentially dangerous drugs to unwitting subjects on more than one occasion. Among those which are simply fascinating, if a little ominous, is the fact that both the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics have programs for isolating the so-called, quote-unquote, wild talents, a term for psionic abilities coined by the science fiction writer Jack Vance, and perhaps putting them to use. I'm not sure which experiments or studies Stephen King is referring to there, because technically that was not part of the goal of MK Ultra, although many people believe that it actually was part of it. Government-funded experiments in this country have centered on influencing the Kirlian aura and proving the existence of telekinesis. Soviet experiments have centered largely on psychic healing and communication by telepathy. Reports filtering out of the USSR suggest that the Soviets have achieved some moderate success with the latter, particularly by using identical twins as communicators. Two other so-called wild talents that both governments have spent money to investigate are the phenomenon of levitation and that of pyrokinesis. A good many real-life incidents of pyrokinesis have been reported. Charles Fort cataloged several in Lowe and the Book of the Damned. These almost always revolve around an act of spontaneous combustion, where almost unimaginable temperatures have been generated. I do not say such a talent or curse exists, and I do not indicate that you should believe it does. I am only suggesting that some of the cases are both eerie and thought-provoking, and I most certainly do not mean to impute that the train of events in this book is likely or even possible. If I mean to suggest anything, it is only that the world, although well lighted with fluorescence and incandescent bulbs and neon, is still full of odd, dark corners and unsettling nooks and crannies. So as we see from this afterword, this whole theme or mindset or distrust for the US government and things that it has done, the crimes it's committed against its own people, is something that permeated American culture in the 1980s. We see that because of things such as the Watergate scandal, the unpopularity with the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth. So in the 1980s, and I've said this before, there was this really strong undercurrent of distrust of government, which is something which Ronald Reagan used to his advantage when he became president. He campaigned on the idea that, as he put it, government is not the solution, government is part of the problem. And he really played into that populist belief or that populist distrust of government that was a big part of American culture at that particular time. And we see that represented in the cultural products of the day, including works like Firestarter. So let's dive into Firestarter. Now, I'm not going to summarize the book or the movie. I'm going to assume that you are familiar with it. I am specifically looking at the book here, which, as I think I said, was published in 1980. There was a very popular film adaptation in 1984 starring Drew Barrymore, whom we've seen before, specifically in E.T., but also in other movies as well. That particular movie does follow the book fairly closely. There are some relatively minor changes made in the movie, and there are certain nuances of the book which do get left out. But on the whole, it's a faithful adaptation. I do also want to mention that just recently in 2022, there was a new film version, a remake released in theaters, which I have not seen and I cannot address. So I cannot speak to the quality of that or how faithful that is to the source material. But like I said, again, I'm focusing specifically on the book here. If you haven't read the book and you've only seen that movie from 1984, like I said, that is a fairly close and faithful adaptation. So you get a really good sense of what the book is about based on that film. So some of the themes of this particular work, as I said, are dislike of government. I mean, that seems a fairly obvious one. And I just want to look at a couple passages that speak directly to that. For example, near the beginning, there's a passage that says, the airport cop felt a wave of dislike for the blank-faced young man behind the wheel of the nondescript green car. He had had peripheral doings with the FBI, the CIA, and the outfit they called the Shop before. Their agents were all the same, blankly arrogant and patronizing. They regarded anyone in a blue suit as a kiddie cop. But when they'd had the hijacking here 5 years ago, it had been the kiddie cops who got the guy, loaded down with grenades, off the plane, and he had been in the custody of the quote-unquote real cops when he committed suicide by opening up his carotid artery with his own fingernails. Nice going, guys. Another example, and this happens on the Manders farm when the Shop agents try to capture Charlie and Andy. Irv Manders says, those men came with no warrants, nor blueback paper of any kind, and tried to take them off our land, he said. People I'd invited in like it's done in a civilized country with decent laws. One of them shot me, and one of them tried to shoot Andy here. Missed his head by no more than a quarter of an inch. Andy remembered the first deafening report and the splinter of wood that had jumped from the porch support post. He shivered. They came and did those things. What do you want me to do, Norma? Sit here and turn them over to the secret police if they get their peckers up enough to come back? Be a good German? So yeah, that theme of the dislike of government is part of the culture, the zeitgeist of that particular time. By contrast, though, we do get a theme about helping strangers. If you can't count on your government to help people out, then you have to rely on each other to help each other out. You see that with the Manders helping out Charlie and Andy and taking them into their home, both in that particular instance, but also later on at the end of the book when Charlie goes to live with them. But there is also another place where you see that expressed much more clearly. Andy and Charlie hitch a ride with a guy driving a van. He handed the $5 to Andy, and suddenly Andy was crying. Not a lot, but crying. No, man, the driver said kindly. He touched the back of Andy's neck lightly. Life is short and pain is long, and we were all put on this earth to help each other. The comic book philosophy of Jim Paulson in a nutshell. Take good care of the little stranger. So that idea that we are put on this earth to help each other, that is an important theme of this particular work, because again, it addresses that issue of not being able to rely on government doing its proper job. We do get into issues or themes of gender identity in here as well. Obviously, the character of Charlie, and we've talked about this before on this podcast, the name of Charlie is a masculine gendered name for the female character here. She dresses in boys' clothes, for example, which she finds to be very funny at one point. But that is a way of helping her to disguise herself. Andy is another example of gender ambiguity, because Andy, of course, is, again, a traditionally male gendered name, but it also can be a female name as well. You know, traditionally, Andy is short for Andrew, but it could also be short for Andrea or Andrea as well. So there is an ambiguity in the character's gender here. And I think that's important because gender and sex becomes an important issue. For one thing, note that female characters are primarily absent here, and those which we do see aren't necessarily positive role models. We do get references to Vicky, Charlie's mother, who ends up dead. There are other women referenced who die. Captain Hollister, for example, reflects on the women in his life and how they have died, specifically his wife and his secretary. And the book says, as if that damn little girl were a personal jinx, the only two women he had cared deeply about since the death of his mother had both died of cancer this winter. His wife, Georgia, 3 days after Christmas, and his personal secretary, Rachel, only a little over a month ago. He had known Georgia was gravely ill, of course. A mastectomy 14 months before her death had slowed but not stopped the progress of the disease. Rachel's death had been a cruel surprise. Near the end, he could remember, how unforgivable we sometimes seem in retrospect, joking that she needed fattening up, and Rachel throwing the joke right back at him. And then the only other prominent female character that we see is Norma Manders. At first, she appears to be a very kindly, welcoming person, but after the incident at the Manders farm, she turns against Andy and Charlie and wants to get rid of them. So she takes on a very negative attitude. So yeah, women here are for the most part absent, or they end up dead. And that is a reflection of the role that men play in this particular story. It is really men who are the cause of most of the problems here. Now, that passage that I just read also introduces a theme of cancer, which connects back to that theme of the dislike of government, because the character of Captain Hollister reflects on the death of these women to cancer and then connects that to the larger social political problems that the US was facing at the time as a type of cancer. Now all he had left was the shop, and he might not have that much longer. An insidious sort of cancer had invaded Cap himself. What would you call it? Cancer of the confidence? Something like that. And in the upper echelons, that sort of disease was nearly always fatal. Nixon, Lance, Helms, all victims of cancer of the credibility. So again, directly referencing the Watergate scandal, as well as the MK Ultra experiments, and how that resulted in the public losing confidence in government. So the destruction of women in this story is an extension of the destruction of American government, or at least public belief and confidence in American government. They're both a type of cancer, and a cancer that is created and perpetrated by men. And that leads into the theme of sexual abuse, which is referenced several times in this particular book. We learn that Vicky was a victim of sexual abuse when she and Andy meet and are subjects of the Lot 6 experiments. They introduce themselves to each other and get to know each other. At another point, he had slept, dozing in and out of a twilight consciousness. He spoke to Vicky, and they told each other about themselves. Andy told her about the car accident that had taken his mother's life, and how he had spent the next year with his aunt in a semi-nervous breakdown of grief. She told him that when she was 7, a teenage babysitter had assaulted her, and now she was terribly afraid of sex, even more afraid that she might be frigid. It was that more than anything else that had forced her and her boyfriend to the breakup. He kept pressing her. And that particular part is relevant because of the character of Charlie here is about 7 to 8 years old, about the same age as her mother was when she was sexually abused by the babysitter. And so that connection is hinted at when the agents of the shop initially abduct Charlie and kill Vicky. Andy goes trying to track them down, and he finds them in a roadside rest station. The men's room door opened and Charlie came out, Flanking her on the left and right were men of about 30 in sport coats, open-throated shirts, and dark double-knit pants. Charlie's face looked blank and shocked. She looked from one of the men to the other and then back at the first. Andy's guts began to roll helplessly. So that image of Charlie being taken out of the men's room by these male agents is uncomfortably evocative of sexual abuse. And so that idea of sexuality and sexual abuse underlies the entire narrative that becomes connected to Charlie's power of pyrokinesis. It is, in some ways, an expression of sexuality. For example, she had been able to initiate that destruction at the Manders farm at the age of 7. Now she was nearly 8. What might happen when she turned 12 and entered adolescence? Maybe nothing. Maybe a great deal. She said she wasn't going to use the power anymore, but if she was forced to use it? What if it began to come out spontaneously? What if she began to light fires in her sleep as a part of her own strange puberty, a fiery counterpart of the nocturnal seminal emission most teenage boys experienced? So there is the suggestion that this power is part of her identity as female, and it is a female power that is being exploited and used and weaponized by men. And that idea that it's being exploited or being controlled relates to the idea of psychological complexes, which is addressed directly in the book itself. The doctor who was responsible for conducting the experiments with the drug, Lot 6, Dr. Wanless, compares Andy and Vicky teaching Charlie how to use her power as a form of toilet training. And he defines toilet training as a psychological complex. For example, King writes, "Ask yourself this, Captain Hollister. How must it have been for Andrew and Victoria McGee when this child was an infant, after they began to make the necessary connection? The bottle is late. The baby cries. At the same time, one of the stuffed animals right there in the crib with her bursts into smoky flame. There is a mess in the diaper. The baby cries. A moment later, the dirty clothes in the hamper begin to burn spontaneously. You have the records, Captain Hollister. You know how it was in that house. A fire extinguisher and a smoke detector in every single room. And once it was her hair, Captain Hollister. They came into her room and found her standing in her crib and screaming, and her hair was on fire." "Yes," Cap said. "It must have made them goddamn nervous." "So," Wanless said, "they toilet trained her, and they fire trained her." Which is only to say that, like my brother and his boy Freddie, they made a complex. You have quoted me that analogy, Captain Hollister. So let us examine it for a moment. What is toilet training? It is the making of a complex, Wanless said. Toilet training is accomplished by focusing the child's attention on his own eliminatory processes in a way we would consider unhealthy if the object of fixation were something different. And then he goes on to connect that idea of installing or instilling a complex, a psychological complex in a child, to what the McGees did in training Charlie in controlling her power. And that idea of the fire training as a type of complex is reinforced later on in the book when it comes to the incident at the Manders farm. Charlie goes into the bathroom in order to get cleaned up, and she's reflecting on what had happened last night and feeling shame because she had accidentally caused a fire to occur. And that idea of creating a psychological complex works by using negative reinforcement in order to make certain behavior considered taboo or socially unacceptable. And that is often the way that sex has been treated within American society, particularly up to that point in time. Sex is something which has been presented as something which is shameful and should not be engaged in. So it is a type of sexual abuse. As the book says, Charlie reached out, grasped the hot shower faucet, and shut it off with a sudden hard twist of her wrist. For the next 2 minutes, she stood shivering and clutching her slight body under the ice-cold and needling spray, wanting to get out, not allowing herself to. When you had bad thoughts, you had to pay for them. And when Charlie uses her powers, it becomes a sort of expression of her sexuality. She begins to take pleasure in it. When the agents attack the farm, Stephen King writes, a gun boomed deafeningly loud, and the splinter of wood, perhaps 8 inches long, jumped from one of the porch's supporting posts. Norma Manders screamed, and Andy flinched. But Charlie seemed not to notice. Her face was dreamy and thoughtful. A small Mona Lisa smile had touched the corners of her mouth. She's enjoying this, Andy thought with something like horror. Is that why she's so afraid of it? Because she likes it? And so, by equating Charlie's powers with sexuality, the exploitation of those powers by the men from the shop and by Rainbird becomes a form of sexual abuse. Unless you think that I'm reading too much into this, that there is a sexual component to the story and to what the character is doing, think about this. Look at one of the dominant symbols and recurring motifs within the book. Obviously, fire is the biggest one. And of course, fire is often associated with heat and passion and strong emotion. But the other dominant symbol in the work is the horse. And the image of the horse appears in 2 primarily different ways, as a force of destruction, but also as a form of female sexuality. So let's take a look at that first way that horses are depicted. When Andy uses his ability to dominate others and create illusions for them, which, by the way, that should be familiar because we've seen that power being used before in other places, but I'll get back to that later. When Andy uses his power, it gives him a headache, and he describes it as being like a horse's hooves thudding in his head. In the back seat, Andy sat with his head back and his eyes closed. The headache was coming, as inexorable as a riderless black horse in a funeral cortege. He could hear the hoofbeats of that horse in his temples. Thud, thud, thud. Thud, thud, thud. Riderless black horse with red eyes coming down the halls of his mind. Iron-shod hooves digging up soft gray clods of brain tissue, leaving hoofprints to fill up with mystic crescents of blood. Thud, thud, thud. Riderless black horse coming on, and coming on. Behold, a black horse. And that's just one instance of where that image of the black horse is used in the particular book. It's used multiple times, and I'm not going to look at every specific instance of it. But I do want to point out that the language that's used in order to describe this headache as being like a black horse is reminiscent of the horsemen of the apocalypse in the way that they're described in the book of Revelation. Specifically, the black horse was the representation of famine as one of the harbingers of Armageddon. And we do get other images of Armageddon expressed in the book. For example, Rainbird thinks about how Charlie could be a harbinger of Armageddon. It was amusing, really. It occurred to Rainbird that this was the way the politicians were going to look when they found out it was finally done, that the missiles were really in the air, the bombs raining down, the woods and cities on fire. It was so amusing he had to laugh and laugh and laugh. And as we've talked about before in this podcast, that whole idea of impending nuclear Armageddon was something which permeated American culture throughout the 1980s. There really was this sense that we could have died at any moment. Someone could push the button and nuclear war would ensue. And so that fatalism is just a common sense or feeling which permeated the 1980s. And we see it again and again in the pop culture as part of the zeitgeist. Obviously, this is just one example of it. And so Stephen King is very deliberately using that idea of, the politicians and the state of the world at the time with the Cold War, resulting in nuclear war and Armageddon as a result of government interference or government experiments in this area. So he's deliberately linking the sorts of things that happened with MK Ultra as a harbinger of coming Armageddon created by politicians. And we see that metaphorically expressed here in the way that the black horse of Armageddon is associated with these powers that Andy has. And then to that point that horses represent female sexuality. Now, that's not something which I am making up. I mean, traditionally, horses have been used in order to represent female sexuality in art and literature before, and that is deliberately happening here. For example, Rainbird comes up with the idea of getting what they want out of Charlie, getting her to use her powers by letting her play with horses. You'll get some mileage out of her just by granting small privileges, Rainbird said. A walk on the lawn, or every little girl loves horses. I'll bet you could get half a dozen fires out of her just by having a groom lead her around the bridle paths on one of those stable necks. That ought to be enough to keep a dozen paper pushers like Hochstetter's dancing on the head of a pin for 5 years. Now, that particular passage isn't explicitly connecting horses with sexuality, although it does say, as Rainbird says, every little girl loves horses, right? There is a deliberate connection of the female with the horse. Later on, King writes, they went into the stables, which were dim and fragrant. Dusky sunlight slanted in, making mellow bars and stripes in which motes of hay chaff danced with dreamy slowness. A groom was currying the mane of a black gelding with a white blaze on its forehead. So a gelding, of course, is a horse that has been castrated, so rendered sexless. And I think it's interesting in that it has a white stripe on its forehead that is described as a blaze, which, of course, a blaze also refers to fire. Charlie stopped, looking at the horse with delighted wonder. The groom looked around at her and grinned. You must be the young miss. They told me to be on the watch out for you. She's so beautiful, Charlie whispered. Her hands trembled to touch that silky coat. One look in the horse's dark, calm, and mellow eyes, and she was in love. Well, it's a boy, actually, the groom said, and tipped a wink at Rainbird, whom he had never seen before and didn't know from Adam. After a fashion, that is. What's his name? Necromancer, the groom said. Want to pet him? A couple things stand out in that particular passage. The reference to Adam. The groom did not know Rainbird from Adam. Of course, Adam being a reference to Adam and Eve, the original couple in the Garden of Eden, from which sex originates. The book says that just by looking at the horse, Charlie is in love. And then one thing that I find particularly amusing is that this horse, which is, like I said, it's castrated. So even though technically it's male, it is sexless. And Charlie perceives it as being female, again, connecting horses with female sexuality. The name of the horse is Necromancer. So a necromancer is a wizard who animates dead things with his or her magic. So we have a horse that's associated with death magic, connecting back to that Armageddon motif. And that idea of connecting the horses again with death and destruction becomes a form of foreshadowing within the book, because the climax of the story is when Charlie escapes from the farm here A farm which, by the way, contrasts with the safe farm of the Manders, where Charlie ultimately goes at the end of the story. But when Charlie escapes from the shop farm, she sets fire to the stables, leading to a rampage of horses. And that is foreshadowed in a dream that she has. John always rode with her, but in her dreams, Charlie rode alone. The head groom, Peter Drabel, had fitted her out with a small, neat English saddle, but in her dreams she rode bareback. She and John rode on the bridle paths that wove their way across the shop ground, moving in and out of the toy forest of sugar pines and skirting the duck pond, never doing more than an easy canter. But in her dreams, she and Necromancer galloped together, faster and faster, through a real forest. They plunged at speed down a wild trail, and the light was green through the interlaced branches overhead, and her hair streamed out behind her. So there was imagery of just sort of being wild and free and unbridled, literally unbridled here. She could feel the ripple of Necromancer's muscles under his silky hide, and she rode with her hands twisted in his mane and whispered in his ear that she wanted to go faster, faster, faster. Necromancer responded. His hooves were thunder. The path through these tangled green woods was a tunnel, and from somewhere behind her there came a faint crackling, and the woods are burning. A whiff of smoke. It was a fire she had started. But there was no guilt, only exhilaration. They could outrace it. Necromancer could go anywhere, do anything. They would escape the forest tunnel. She could sense brightness ahead. Faster, faster. So we get imagery that is associated with the sexual act, right? The exhilaration, the freedom. She could no longer tell where her thighs ended and Necromancer's sides began. They were one, fused as the metal she welded with her power when she did their tests. Ahead of them was a huge deadfall, a blowdown of white wood like a tangled cairn of bones. Wild with lunatic joy, she kicked at Necromancer lightly with her bare heels and felt his hindquarters bunch. They leaped it, for a moment floating in the air. Her head was back, her hands held horsehair as she screamed, not in fear, but simply because not to scream, to hold in, might cause her to explode. Free, free, free. Necromancer, I love you. They cleared the deadfall easily, but now the smell of smoke was sharper, clearer. There was a popping sound from behind them, and it was only when a spark spiraled down and briefly stung her flesh like a nettle before going out that she realized she was naked. Naked but the woods are burning. Free, unfettered, loose, she and Necromancer running for the light. Faster, she whispered. Faster, oh please. So, yeah, I don't know how else you would read that except for an expression of sexuality and the dangers that people have traditionally placed upon it, which plays into that traditional belief or idea that female sexuality needs to be reined in and needs to be controlled, because if you let it go, if you don't control it, that it leads to this sort of destruction. And that's exactly what happens at the end of the story when Charlie, her father is killed and she lets her power go completely free and becomes the Firestarter.
And doesn't that just sound like a superhero? Firestarter. That sounds pretty cool.
So once she lets go of her power, the men, the agents, try to rein it in by killing the horses. But by then it is much too late. So as the book says, Don Jules had found himself in charge by default. He held on as long as he could after the fire started, convinced that the little girl would run out into their field of fire. When it didn't happen, and when the men in front of the stables began to catch the first glimpse of what had happened to the men behind it, he decided he could wait no longer, not if he wanted to hold them. He began to move forward, and the others came with him, but their faces were tight and set. They no longer looked like men on a turkey shoot. Then shadows moved rapidly inside the double doors. She was coming out. Guns came up. 2 men fired before anything at all came out. But it wasn't the girl. It was the horses, 6 of them, 8, 10, their coats flecked with foam, their eyes rolling and white-rimmed, mad with fear. Jules' men on hair trigger opened fire. Even those who had held back, seeing that horses rather than humans were leaving the stable, seemed unable to hold back once their colleagues had begun firing. It was a slaughter. Two of the horses pitched forward to their knees, one of them whinnying miserably. Blood flew in the bright October air and slicked the grass. Stop, Jules bawled. Stop, damn it. Stop shooting the fucking horses. He might as well have been King Canute giving orders to the tide. The men, afraid of something they could not see, hyped by the alarm buzzer, the bright yellow alert, the fire that was now pluming thick black smoke at the air, and the heavy kawoom of the exploding tractor gas, finally had moving targets to shoot at, and they were shooting. So this pent-up fear and paranoia that these government agents have is let loose in a type of Armageddon.
And so the fear that these male agents are expressing and feeling represents fear of the female and fear specifically of female sexuality.
So there is a sort of cautionary tale being expressed here that when men, explicitly men, try to control a primal force exuded by the female, it is kind of doomed to failure, that it's going to backfire on them. No pun intended. So that's essentially Firestarter and what Firestarter is about. How does this relate to Stranger Things and other texts that we've looked at so far? First of all, as I alluded to earlier, there are some clear parallels to the X-Men and the Dark Phoenix saga. Quite obviously. I mean, of course, the character of Phoenix being a bird that dies and is reborn in fire, there's that obvious connection. We have another connection in the way that Andy controls people by creating illusions in their head, which is exactly what happens in that particular story with the character of Mastermind trying to control Phoenix by creating illusions in her head, and how that all ultimately backfires, leading to the destruction of this world that Phoenix destroys and ultimately resulting in her downfall. So there are very clear parallels, I think, between Firestarter and the Dark Phoenix saga, which were published in approximately the same time frame of the early 80s. And then Stranger Things. We've seen the connections between the X-Men and Stranger Things. We've talked about those before. And once we see the connection between Firestarter and X-Men, that connection between Firestarter and Stranger Things becomes really apparent. Obviously, Eleven is in the same position as Charlie in Firestarter. Her powers are the product of government experimentation with drugs, specifically hallucinogens. Dr. Brenner in Stranger Things was a participant in the MK Ultra program as Hopper unearths. So yeah, there are very clear parallels being drawn deliberately by the creators of Stranger Things with what was happening, not just in Firestarter, but playing into these feelings, fears, and paranoias that were really extant in America in the 1980s. Okay, so that's it for today. Okay, next time we're going to take a deeper dive into the bathtub, if you'll pardon the pun, by looking at Chapter 7 of Stranger Things in that first season, which is the episode called The Bathtub. So we will talk about that next time. Thanks for joining me, and as always, stay strange. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by dreadpirateproductions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxam, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions at gmail.com.